Hi, everyone. Welcome to this first plenary session on the conceptual aspects and dimensions of science diplomacy. My name is Dr. Marga Gual, and I am a member of the S4D4C team. And I am delighted to have with me today two of the lead researchers on this conceptual, more academic aspects of science diplomacy, Tim Flink and Mitchell Young. So because we only have a few minutes, this is the spotlight session, meaning that we're going to have a discussion among the S4D4C team before we move into a speakers panel that is going to touch upon this topic on from the external stakeholders' perspective. So we are going to dive right into it. So Mitchell and Tim have been at the forefront of unpacking and analyzing, critiquing, and advancing our understanding of science diplomacy as a field of research. And you will all know that they have published really interesting work. They have done empirical research, talked and interviewed many stakeholders. So today we are going to hear their insights, what they have found, and how we can better understand the conceptual aspects and the discourse around science diplomacy, and then link it with practice. So welcome, Tim and Mitchell. Just confirming that you're here. Okay, all right, so let's start by, if you can give us, maybe Tim, start with a brief overview of the history of the concept of science diplomacy over the last 20 years. Where are we now, and what's the work that you've done to unpack and advance science diplomacy as a concept?
Well, yeah, thank you very much for this great opportunity. Also, hello from my part in Berlin. So you're asking a very tricky question because the time is limited, but maybe just to give a few examples so that we know that we're on the same side. Everybody is aware that science, technology, and international affairs share a long-standing relationship for a couple of centuries in Europe. And this is not what we are talking about when we talk about the public discourse on science diplomacy, but what we are talking about is raising awareness since the early millennial years. You can track that in Google Scholar, Ngram, and a lot of other archives, that the term science diplomacy, and with it the awareness, has risen of these years. And just to give one example, I think everybody knows that by heart now. The Obama administration in 2008 to 2009, when President Obama was running and campaigning and then running his office, started to use science diplomacy. And I think this was one of the watershed moments to make it really public as some sort of an image campaign, especially to resurrect the United States image abroad and do some soft power kind of approach using the positive image of science. And then at the same time, some years before, some years later, various OECD governments started to frame their existing or new activities at the intersection from science, technology, and innovation and foreign affairs as science diplomacy. And as we all know also, this was encapsulated, so to speak, or epitomized by the Royal Society, and together with the AAAS as one of the entrepreneurs in this field, in a tripartite definition what science diplomacy can mean. And not least, as we've heard from today's first introduction, as of 2009, the European Union, with the new Lisbon Treaty, started to engage in this activity, especially with the strengthened European External Action Service, trying to coordinate activities with DG Research. And this is probably the mainstream approach that governments and their science, technology, innovation, and higher education ministries and the foreign ministries see it as a new opportunity to operate abroad for various means and ends and by various means. I stop that in regard of the time now.
Great. Thanks, Tim. So following on that, I would like to ask you, Mitchell, about how science diplomacy has somewhat become like a buzzword, a term. Some have called it like a marketing term, and that has raised concerns about perhaps diluting its meaning. And so you've done quite an intensive work to really elucidate what matters in science diplomacy, try to perhaps come up with a new framework. And S4D4C just a couple of weeks ago published this new protocol on science diplomacy. So do we need a new conceptual framework, and where are we on that?
Yeah, I guess the short answer is I would say yes, we do need a new framework, or we need new frameworks, I would actually say. And that doesn't mean that we scrap the old ones. I mean, we have good old frameworks. I mean, as Tim was just talking about, the AAAS Royal Society one, it's a very useful framework. It's a great first step. Somebody asks you, well, what is science diplomacy? I find the best way that I can explain it to them. And yet, when I want to go deeper, when I want to really explain what is happening in science diplomacy, I start to run into problems with it. I mean, it just doesn't get us deep enough. And so that's what we've been trying to do in the project. You mentioned this Matters report that we put together. And we tried to come up with some, I guess you would call them theoretical anchors, ways that we can go deeper into understanding the concept in a way that's multidimensional, multifaceted. There really isn't a single definition of science diplomacy, and trying to pursue that we've found to be pretty futile in the project. And so by looking at different aspects, so looking at the implicit explicit dimension, looking at values, of course looking at interest, which there is also a good framework out there for, looking at perspectives, looking at different levels and scales, and in fact not only just the scale administratively, but the epistemic scales we've talked about in our work, and the geographical scales of science diplomacy. And I think I could talk for a long time, I'll leave it there, but I think the point is we need to go deeper. We need more explanatory theoretical frameworks to get into this concept and to make it, I mean, it's good it's a buzzword. It's good that it's out there. It's good that people are using this term. We want that, but at the same time, we need to deepen our understanding of it.
Right. Let's get a little more deep into that, because so you talk about implicit, explicit dimensions of science diplomacy. We know that sometimes some actions or policies, programs can be understood as science diplomacy, but they don't carry that label. And there is a value, and we've seen, and I think the project has proven that there is a value of giving things a name, so communities can come together, like the scientific community and the foreign policy community come together in ways that didn't come together before. But I want to ask you about the negative sides of the potential negative sides of this. So has there been in your research an instance that you found that science diplomacy was using that label was counterproductive, or it could backfire when some processes were maybe sensitive or confidential and not public? And I know, Tim, you've done some deep research and interviews with some actors that have told you that perhaps using that term is not always positive and beneficial for those, for the goal. So whether sometimes it's better to keep it implicit. Can you speak a little bit on that?
Yes, Mitchell, if you allow, I would take on that. So first of all, I'd like to come back to what Mitchell said. We need to distinguish between two things. One is the action that people might call science diplomacy. So let's say researchers or policymakers, science managers from research funding agencies interact with each other abroad and also address, sometimes even delicate issues, so they want to collaborate. Sometimes it's about competition. So these actions can be deemed or called science diplomacy without these actors even knowing that they are doing it. And sometimes if you approach actors and ask them, how do you describe the actions that you're doing there? They would never tell you that this is science diplomacy. Not even science attaches in embassies, or permanent representations would call it that way. On the other hand, we have a discourse that is explicitly using that concept for specific purposes, and S4D4C is part of it. So we need to face that we also in a political realm here. And with this distinction, when do you make use of that term specifically vis-a-vis the action, that is somehow international science, technology, innovation, policy making? We are also already getting into, some messy situation where we need different concepts to approach it. Not least, another distinction is, when do we talk about scientists? When do we talk about actors in general? So scientists can be very political, depending in which situation they are based and what they are, doing at the moment. So negative examples, yes, there are a few. So in certain discursive areas where we're talking about the global north and the global south, science diplomacy by some actors was, let's say, described as a negative and condescending means of exploiting, knowledge from the global south and exploiting capacities and all that. And there have been intense research activities going on showing that it could also be backfiring on probably well-intended activities in international scientific affairs once the term gets overused or used in wrong situations for you. The other one is the big question of collaboration versus competition, especially when we are talking with actors that we associate with authoritarian regimes. So will these also use science diplomacy just the way we use that? Is it then good to, collaborate with them in a euphemistic way and using the term? I stopped rambling here about the other aspects again for the sake of time. Yeah.
No, that's a very important point, right? Because the Madrid Declaration on Science Diplomacy that we launched in 2018 at the first networking meeting had this very clear focus on science diplomacy should advance democratic values. So you're bringing extremely important points on whether that can be, that science diplomacy can be used as some sort of window dressing for, authoritarian states, and you've written about it. So everything we're talking about here, we have, tons of papers that we would love you to explore, and, Tim and Mitchell have written extensively about all of that. I see you, Mitchell, also wanting to say something about this before we move on.
Well, I could say a lot about it, but
I know
we can also move on, because I think Tim's captured a lot of what we want to say here about this sort of dynamic. I mean, I think it's just important that we think about it. There are policy actors, the diplomats themselves, when they use this, and when they choose or not choose to apply the concept has some real political implications. In other words, when science cooperation becomes science diplomacy, there's perhaps an assumption of a quid pro quo, that there's some sort of a trade-off that can be happening, and it's not just a pure sort of positive development. So I think there's nuances there, and I think, for example, if we think about the case that we did on the Sesame infrastructure in the Middle East, we see that there's even differing dialogues, different narratives, that the explicit narrative on Sesame is that this is a peace building initiative. And yet what we see of the internal actors is they really see this as something that's about scientific excellence. And they're not particularly engaged even with that story, with that aspect of it. So this is why we really need to think about these as two separate things, and address them both.
Right, exactly. And this is going to be more important moving forward as more countries and regions in the global south are really, looking to contextualize science diplomacy to their own context. So we see a lot of momentum in Latin America, South Africa, India. So there's now a new narrative building on around these parts of the world. So it's going to be really interesting to see how we reconcile the different north-south dynamics. And building on something you've just said, touch upon about Sesame. It's in a paper that was also a report published recently by S4D4C, is the evaluation piece. How do we know that science diplomacy actions or policies or programs are effective? What kind of evaluative framework do we need to really consolidate science diplomacy in our policy toolkit?
Well, maybe I take this first again. So from what I've observed over the last years is that, and this is important to get this evaluation idea straight and correct, is that we as the consortia, as well as other actors that also have a big share on promoting science diplomacy, are promising things to the world of science, technology, international affairs. The question is, can these promises live up to the expectations? So if we look at what has been done in terms of these very affirmative projects, there has been a lot of single case studies around, some current ones, as Mitchell has already said, about Sesame, about joint programming, infectious diseases, COVID, especially in recent times. And there have been plenty of historical reconstructions, the Cold War. So Inside is doing a lot of these great historical case studies. But my question is, why and how do we use these single case studies? Are they instrumental for political purposes, or do they have an analytical value that we can really step back, certain steps, and look at what is going on with science diplomacy? And so the idea is that we need to be evaluative in a comparative way. We have to take, specific time spans and say, okay, this is when a science diplomacy action was kicked into place and it had certain effects, and evaluation techniques are out there. I don't have to tell them. The second one is we need to have a framework where all involved parties can have their say. That is to say, it's not about, for example, the German Research Foundation, the BMBF, or the European Commission, or who is out there assessing only their own programs, but they need to do it also and calculate with the partners they are addressing, especially in spheres where it's about the global north and the global south. So is a science diplomacy mechanism effective and beneficial to all involved parties, or on a minimum scale, not detrimental to one single party? That is the most important aspect to strengthen the value of the concept, because if it is to some extent, detrimental to one party, why engaging in it? And I leave it at that point again, due to the time span.
Mitchell, you want to weigh in?
I think I'll leave Tim's comment on that. He's really covered it very well.
Great, fantastic. Yeah, we're short on time, so we're racing to cover everything we want to cover. So one of the aspects you touch upon, this collaboration versus competition in science diplomacy. This has been another hot topic, not just with S4D4C, but inside and our partner researchers. So one of the examples of that dynamic and potential divergence is the technology diplomacy. Right now, it's a very, it's a growing trend for governments, for ministries to appoint tech ambassadors, tech diplomacy, digital diplomacy. And there's quite a bit of a debate whether science and technology diplomacy can come together, go together, or they should be separated strands, because science is more about the global cooperation for global goods versus technology, more competition, economic competitiveness, and national interest. So I will invite you to both to expand on that, because I know you've thought about it as well quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to talk so much about the technology as opposed to science. I mean, to me, those boundaries are already well blurred. I think if we think about mode 2 science, this idea of co-production of science, the idea that basic science and applied science is a false division. It's maybe useful in certain circumstances, but overall, like, I think that this is all connected together. I mean, we see the ERC doing proof of concept things, so bringing the science into the applied field. So I don't see any issues with bringing those two areas together. But when we talk about this competition and collaboration aspect, this is I think crucial. I think in some ways science is particularly good at that. Scientists are used to both competing for discoveries and collaborating with each other, and so this dynamic works pretty well in the field of science, and maybe that can be sort of taken over into other fields. And I think, this comes back to something Tim was saying earlier about sort of authoritarian regimes. And I think if we think sort of broadly about this, if we think, what are we competing over? If we're competing over actually the discovery, if we're competing over knowledge, this is a very positive thing. When we're competing over other things, and clearly right now in the world, we're competing over the liberal world order. We're competing, and I think it's very important that the EU stands firm and brings its strength behind supporting the liberal world order and the values that entails. At the same time, we really see that we're competing with China on a lot of different aspects. And when we come to some of these questions about, well, what can we compete on and what can we cooperate on? Science is something that we can cooperate on. China has become really this knowledge superpower, and they share with us to a large extent an interest in science. And so I think we need to take that as a starting point, as a stepping stone in that relationship, which is obviously quite fraught in other areas. And so I think that science, in this very kind of Mertonian way, in terms of the norms of science, can be used to sort of build these sort of relationships. And obviously that's a fragile sort of foundation to build on. And at the same time, I think it can be quite productive. If we think in terms of global challenges, this is something that we need all the countries of the world, regardless of whether they're authoritarian or democratic, to be part of. And so I think that that split between understanding this competition over values and the liberal world order, and the competition over the threat to our environment and the physical world that we live in, that's something that we can address very strongly through science diplomacy.
Yeah, and this reminds me to the recent appointment of Secretary John Kerry as a special envoy for climate in the US, and how there was a lot of debate whether you could compartmentalize foreign policy and collaborate in areas like climate, health, but compete in other areas. So I want to close this conversation just coming back to what Tim said in the first remark about watershed moments. So the Obama 2009 big push for science diplomacy, that was one of the watershed moments. What do you see moving forward in the, is the Biden-Harris administration a new watershed moment? How has the world changed? Whether that's going to, kind of help bring multilateralism back, of course, with the EU, the issue of values that Mitchell just talked about, and whether we can compartmentalize and still, do the cooperation on the issues that need the global participation while keeping our strategic sovereignty and all of those words that are also now the buzzwords in terms of reducing global dependence on critical materials, technologies, etc. So what big picture, where is the world going in science diplomacy in the next 10 years, 20 years?
$1 billion question you asked, but to be normative in this, my few answers probably, I guess the Biden-Harris administration needs to be very strong putting the wheel back or drawing the wheel back, because the difference between Obama and Bush was not that big as regards, taking to scientific expertise, financing scientific institutions and funding agencies. I mean, with Trump, I mean, this is completely unbearable if you look how the White House and NSF and others being treated regarding expertise. So my sincere wish is that the Biden-Harris administration is strengthening multilateralism again and investing more into science. And that is probably the best and most robust investment you can do, especially also for science diplomacy, because if it has no resources, it will remain a lofty promise, but it needs to have funding resources for the science system to be strengthened meanwhile.
Great, thank you, Tim. Last words from Mitchell before we close.
No, I'll just say, because I know we're over time, that I share Tim's hopes and optimisms for multilateralism in this new administration.
Thank you. Thank you both. This has been a short, but I think intense discussion. I want to bring your attention to our drawer, who is in real time drawing what's being discussed. This is even a more challenging task. So, just take a look at how these ideas are being now captured in this very graphic way. So thank you so much to our designer. Thank you, Tim Mitchell. And now I will hand it to Anna for our panel to continue discussing on these issues. Thank you so much. And Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marga. Thank you also for the interesting conversation, and it will set up the scene a little bit for us now. And the group I have here, I'm honored, really, and happy. I think they are fantastic panelists and with a lot of force and passion. So I will have the privilege to count with David Mayer from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Suvi Sepalainen is also with us from the European External Action Service, and Rana Dajani, coming from SASTA, president of SASTA, will join us today also. And finally, we have Thomas Flinchi de Lanoville coming from Rennes School of Business. So please let me start saying that today in this panel, what we want to do is to reflect also a little bit on the nature of science into policy. And especially, I would like to reflect and to explore a little bit the limits of science into policy. We have seen that during the pandemic, we have seen a key role for science and for the scientific institutions. We have been seeing that they go further than they normally do. They were in their labs, and they were obliged somehow to have also a new mandate of scientific advice during the co-evolution of the pandemic. And however, we have seen also that these connection channels were not always working properly. And this connection between science and foreign policy and decisions and collaboration was not a smooth pathway. So what can science offer now and in the future at the political and societal level? And we will discuss also the different array of science advice mechanisms, their input into evidence-informed foreign policy making. First of all, to be able to know a little bit more about our speakers, I would like to ask them to introduce themselves and to shortly relate how science diplomacy for addressing global challenges relates to their daily work. So maybe we can start with you, Rana, if you don't mind. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more and to talk about your daily job related to this issue?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this panel and to discuss this a very important issue, especially today within COVID-19, which has shown us how similar we are and how much we have to share and how much is at stake. So I'm a professor of molecular cell biology at the Humboldt-Universität in Jordan. My work is related to epigenetics of trauma and how is that transmitted across generations, as well as the studying ethnic populations in Jordan and trying to understand the genetic risk factors that expose them to multiple complex diseases such as diabetes. Currently, I'm a visiting professor at the University of Richmond in Virginia, and I am as such the president of the Society for the Advancement of Science and Technology in the Arab World. And this is a network of senior scientists in diaspora outside the Arab world. And the objective of this network is to harness the potential of these senior scientists on how they can help mentor, advise, advance science and technology in the Arab world. As in any other country and region, there's a huge diaspora. And this is a huge potential that we are trying to figure out how to harness, how to utilize, so that there's a collaboration and a win-win on both sides.
Thank you, Rana. David, could you please follow a little bit up?
Thank you very much. I'm lucky enough to work for the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, the Science and Knowledge Service. So our job is to bring science into all EU policy areas. We have pretty much every scientific discipline, and we work for pretty much every policy, including external relations policy on a number of files. My particular interest is how to equip scientists with the skills to talk effectively to policymakers so that they actually change their minds and so that knowledge and facts actually influence the policy process, but also on the other side to train and equip policymakers with the skills to ask for the evidence, to interrogate it, and to use it. And long story short, the relationship between science and policy, facts and values is very difficult and complicated. These are two worlds that are not alike at all, but yet we must somehow bring them together.
Thank you, David. Maybe Suvi, would you be so nice to introduce yourself and how your work relates to science, diplomacy, and technology?
Thanks so much for having me and for organizing this conference. So I work at the European External Action Service, which is the European Union's Foreign and Security Policy Service. My home base is in the Strategic Policy Planning Unit, which takes a slightly more sort of a forward-looking approach to our policies, and I concentrate particularly on technology. So the science aspect is obviously very prevalent there. I look particularly at the geopolitical implications of technology, what it means for Europe and what it means for our standing in the world. The external aspects of the EU's digital agenda are becoming sort of increasingly pronounced, and that is quite a sort of a growing area of work for us. Another file that relates to science diplomacy that I'm involved in is strategic foresight. So this is another area that the European Commission and the External Action Service are putting a lot of emphasis and focus on. And that is very much in the interest of sort of being forward-looking and having the best sort of data-oriented, evidence-based information at our hand to inform our policies today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We will be talking a little bit more about that later on. And then maybe Thomas, if you can introduce a little bit yourself and yeah, continue.
Yeah. So Thomas Flischendeville, I am a historian of diplomacy. I have studied the issue of diplomacy throughout history and its successes and failures. Of course, diplomacy, being the art of public negotiation, involves various actors and channels, but often diplomacy needs, in fact, two channels so as to succeed: an official voice and a non-official voice. And we have seen that very often academics or doctors in medicine have played a very active role in parallel diplomacy. Of course, the 21st century has been marked by a crisis of the traditional diplomatic services. And that's precisely what's happening at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Nice introduction. And I would like to ask, first of all, David, about the rapid production of new science during COVID-19. That raises also a lot of questions. It was like a tsunami of information, and we'd like to know, how do you, for example, cope with the information? How do we differentiate on high quality science and low quality science, or even misinformation sometimes? How do we do this?
Thanks very much. So it's clearly been a huge problem in the COVID crisis. We in the JRC, for our own work supporting our policymaking colleagues, had to set up new ways of working together, particularly bringing different disciplines together, which I think is really one of the leitmotifs of the whole COVID crisis. It has shown something I think we knew already, which is that policymakers don't need one particular scientific discipline. They need joined up science that works across disciplines. And the great problem we have is everyone has been saying these nice words about interdisciplinary working for years, but the number of people who actually do it, invest in it, and do it successfully, you can count on the fingers of one hand, basically. So we have this huge problem is, how do you get different disciplines, which are currently seem to be fragmenting more and more, to work together to understand the policy questions and bring together the answers. So that is certainly one part of the answer, is learning how to do interdisciplinary working. The other way is making sure you have effective, what we call ecosystems for science policy. So we have a workshop series at the moment on how each member state of the European Union can develop a robust science policy ecosystem. So you probably need all the working parts to be working. You need the scientists in government, the scientists in the academies, the scientists in the universities, in the regulatory agencies, in the foreign ministries, and the research agencies. The question is, do you have people equipped in those places? And are there the institutions, the processes, and the procedures to connect them all, so that when you need to respond quickly, you are able to mobilize the knowledge, but also the ability to appraise the knowledge very, very quickly. So that's my short answer, is we need to rapidly upscale interdisciplinary working. And secondly, we need to think about building not machines, but ecosystems of science policy expertise. Are you able to connect up the knowledge to the people who need it in the right time, in the right place, in the right format?
And also maybe to society. I mean, we need also to be connected with society, but because we have seen also that this huge crisis will amplify, I would say, the existing social fractures and inequalities. And this will have political consequences also, as we know. So maybe Thomas, can you tell me what is the impact in the international order of the current public health crisis? It will have an impact. And how was the co-evolution of policy and science during the pandemic? How do you see this co-evolution?
I think the crisis has had many impacts on the world order. Of course, the first impact is on economics. In fact, the COVID has spawned the collapse of the parasitic economy. It has brought about an important recession and a sort of artificial and temporary restoration of borders. But in fact, new borders are separating today individuals one from another. The societies have exploded into individual bubbles. And of course, the fear of death has raised the expectancies of societies towards governments. But the polities at the summit have been very often irrational, erratic, and the masses and the elites have responded in very different ways to the pandemic. We've seen also that facts and figures have very much disputed. And we've noticed a sort of incapacity organized scientific debates on the pandemic in a rational way. So we can see that societies have been really destabilized, and the COVID is completely reorganizing the world geopolitics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Maybe I'll go for Subi now. How technology affects this global order, and what do you think is the role of the external service here?
Well, it feels like we're living in a sort of a watershed moment in the way that we define geopolitics today, and it feels quite different from how it was just a few years ago. And it's clear that emerging technologies in particular have become sort of both an object and a driver of geopolitical competition, but cooperation as well. The different ways of thinking about it, the way that I sort of scheme it out for myself is I put it into different baskets. I look at the security and defense implications. Then a second basket would be geoeconomics. And the third would be values and human rights and the health and stability of our democracies. And so for me, this helps me to unpack the concept of geopolitics, of technology and what it means. It's interesting how also this has then come to obviously impact on how we perceive foreign and security policy and how we do it in practice. There's a big pedagogical issue here. A few years ago, we probably wouldn't have been expected to know as much as we are expected to know today about new technologies, for example, or of climate change as a security issue. So diplomats are really, I would say, we're on a learning curve here in order to do our jobs well and to adapt to the times that we're living in. And we see increasingly that the internal and external policies, that distinction sometimes almost doesn't make sense, because there's a lot of interaction going on, and the way that they interact with each other, the internal and the external aspects. I would just mention on the technology and geopolitics part also that there's so much interest these days about European Union's approach to technology and the digital economy in general. As you know, we are frontlining a lot of the early efforts in terms of regulation, for example, as we did with GDPR on privacy. There are other issues that have been put forward in terms of antitrust and the way that the digital economy should work. And it's a very unique approach in that it very much puts the sort of the human-centric, the human values-based approach at the center, which sets us aside from many other actors. And it's interesting to see how much interest there is politically in that by our partners around the world. So these days in political dialogues, technology is very much sort of a key issue that we are expected to discuss with authority and to advance these issues also together with our allies. And EAS is of course very much involved in this work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Subi. So, I mean, this complex interface between science policy and diplomacy relies also, I would say, on the power of networks and probably the coordination, the appropriate coordination to make the most of them. So maybe Rana, can you tell us a little bit about how can the scientists contribute to this endeavor? How can they join this ecosystem that David was talking about?
Yeah, thank you. I think networks are really important, not just within country, because I mean, we can take this conversation at different levels, either within the country and the policy within a country, within a region, Europe, the Arab world, or globally. And when you say globally, how do you invite and utilize the scientist commitment and feeling of belonging to help their own regions and countries? Hence, or the whole globe, right? Because I think COVID-19 has shown us how our commitment is not just to our countries and regions, but actually to the whole globe. If you fix one place, you're helping fix everybody else because we're so connected. And so what we've done from our experience in the network at the SASTA, our acronym, is to develop a strategy to harness that potential. So what we do is we do not, within our network, we don't give expectations for the members of our network. We treat them or look at them as each one of them is an island of themselves, and that if they have the energy or the need to belong, to give, that we are that they could use us as an umbrella to go and step out into the world and make a difference. Now, this strategy is very important because that way you already filter those who already want to do the good and they need help, they need a push, they need some action potential, to distinguishing them from others who are just waiting and to complain and to blame, because we know it's about changing mindsets. Right? We always have the scientists who are already complaining and blaming the government and others, and those who really step up. So I think having that freedom to join a network, quit whenever you want, will be its own filter to keep those who are really sincere, and that way they will find each other and start working together. So that's number one. Number two is to connect networks together. Right? Because it's not just about scientists by themselves working. So for example, if there's a network for social entrepreneurs, a network for politicians, a network for scientists, to kind of hook up these networks together, find those hubs of where they overlap, and then again, allow that kind of strategy where like people come together because they have a common good. And I draw this kind of philosophy from biology. We know we have the unity, the DNA that all of us share, and the diversity, which produced all this diversity. So again, if we can find a common goal, then everybody will come from across disciplines, cultures, different socioeconomic status to come together to make a difference. But it needs patience, and it needs trust, and it needs to listen. Because we always tend to micromanage, we always tend to want to control rather than allowing things to organically develop by themselves to produce something that in the end is very good. And this leads me to, so it's not about just, as mentioned earlier, it's not about just science and diplomacy, it's science and society, right? Because in the end, the scientist and the diplomat are from the community. And so if we don't raise awareness to the importance of science across the board, starting very early, then you won't be able to engage in that kind of dialogue going forward in terms of developing these networks. And then if we have these networks, we can then look at systems and try to identify pivotal points to initiate change. Because it's not about changing here and there like a Band-Aid. It's about finding the pivotal points, the root causes, and working together. And if you push those, change those, you're ultimately changing the whole system going forward. And today with COVID-19, we see how this is not just the only way, it is possible, right? Such talk was talked about in the past, but there were too many bureaucracy and barriers. But I think what COVID-19 has shown us that these all can, if we all really have a purpose, again, back to that one goal, we can make a difference moving forward. So again, back to that's the collaboration that was mentioned before rather than the competition, because we're all in this together. Yeah. And the last point I'm going to say is that how every member of that network and every network is important. So the world is flat today with COVID-19. So if you're a scientist in the global south, the global north needs you, or the west and the east, or for lack of a different thing, because we bring, every person, every country brings to the table a unique experience and unique perspective to help us solve the 21st challenges that we are facing today.
Thank you, Rana. I would then maybe ask David, how do we change the mindset? How do we train these new generations for the ecosystem of policy advice and science advice? Scientists, and we have seen in our project that when we prepared the online course for science diplomacy, we had more than 6,000 people registering for this. So clearly scientists wanted to have a notion and input about this new issue. How do we train those scientists and those policymakers and diplomats?
I think we are in the JRC beginning to understand that. We have trained 600 JRC scientists in how to achieve policy impact. We've just put online a webinar with a sort of quick 90-minute first dive into this topic that's publicly available. We've just published a call for training the trainers in Europe, and we're going to be building a network of trainers who can then go off and train the community of scientists. And we're also trying to work on the policymaking side. We're working to develop the professional framework from policymaking, which will have, we hope, the ability to understand and use scientific evidence at the heart of the job of being a policymaker. And all this work we are doing not just for the EU institutions, we're doing it with the member states, and I hope also make this globally available. So I think we do know a few things on how to do it. It looks a bit daunting when you start, but as I say, we've trained 600 JRC scientists who started at the same place that many of people listening are at. And I have to say, I'm not a scientist. I come from the policy-making world. And I think it's a lot easier to train scientists in how to interact with policymakers than to train policymakers how to become scientists. So difficult as it may seem, and these are difficult worlds, and it sometimes feels way outside your comfort zone, but still I'm optimistic that effective, excellent scientists can learn effective, influential skills in the policymaking sphere. And I think we now know how to do that.
Super, great. We need that. So I would say that now for Thomas, this is something that is really striking. Science advice has never been in a greater demand, but we have also seen an increasing of distrust in expertise. So Thomas, how do we avoid this misuse of science into policymaking? How do we ensure that science has some impact on policy and is not, I mean, on the other hand, how do we see the limits of science into policy? Yeah. I don't know if Thomas is connected. Can you hear me, Thomas?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
So your question about the active role that scientists can play as diplomats between states when sometimes there's a problem and sometimes install or restore dialogue, though the diplomacy failed. That's really the point on which you asked your question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I can hear you a little bit cut sometimes, but I think, yes, you had the point.
Yeah, I think we have many examples throughout here. We see that there's an official voice, but it's very evident, and some so the diplomatic are a bit slow. They've become a bureaucracy, and of course, academics have the possibility to. First of all, they are in permanent dialogue despite geographical differences between states. So I think they're able to continue and to pursue a dialogue despite oppositions states. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Really?
but I don't know if it's me or maybe the others too, but it's a little bit...
Yes, apparently difficult to understand. So I leave the floor. Okay, that sounds okay. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I will maybe continue with some other colleagues and then we will see. Yeah. Okay, so maybe Subi, if you can tell me a little bit when we think about this co-evolution of policy and science for the next future, the EU is in a unique position to lead this science diplomacy approach to address global challenges because of many reasons. We have been talking here about values, about the right cooperation dynamics, the networks, etc. How can the external service be a driver in this process? How do you see the role of the external service here?
Well, we do a lot of work related to this and have done already for the past years. Not that we're an old organization, we just had our 10-year anniversary, so we're still kind of molding ourselves and our working methods. But science is something that is part of the day-to-day work, whether it's called science diplomacy or not. And there are some examples like the Iran nuclear deal where science and scientists played a key role, also in helping to inform regional policies such as towards the Arctic or space policy or climate diplomacy. There's so many examples of that work already. So I think one of the first questions that comes to my mind is maybe we should be better at highlighting some of the ongoing work and sort of lead by example of what is already being done. But then that's not to say that more shouldn't be done, because of course the ambition is much higher. And I don't think that our colleagues would need a lot of convincing about the role of science. I've given you some examples in the way that it's already integrated into the work. It becomes a resource question quite quickly. We have a good example right now in our own team where we have a science advisor since last summer. And I think I can speak on behalf of my colleagues when I say that it's really, it's amazing how big of an impact one person can have. That person cannot represent all of science, but can bring that specific viewpoint that is specific to the work culture that we are in, responding to the priorities that we have, because every organization is different. So I think there are initiatives ongoing, and I think, as I said, one thing is speaking more and more visibly about the work that is ongoing. And then second is looking at sort of how do we create more space for that interaction. And I think we now have some more experience under our belt about how best to do it in our own system. What are our own specific needs? And then that helps us going forward as we sort of tailor more EAS specific responses to advancing science diplomacy. And then the coordination role is very important. As you know, we work very closely with EU member states, and some first steps have already been taken there as well in terms of bringing science advisors, science diplomacy advisors together. And clearly my impression from that work is that there's a lot of interest from our member states for us to do more and to do better together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, I think it might be one of the few maybe places where all can agree at some point. So it's you should foster that strategy for sure. So maybe just to come back a little bit about what David said, that how do you get all these different disciplines working together, Rana? How can we make all these scientists that take part of these networks from different disciplines coming together for a joint goal?
Yes, great question. And it's not just about how do you get scientists together, how do you get the scientists and the diplomats together, and how do you get everybody together to work in a way to solve the problems together. I think first of all, it comes with respect. To respect everybody, right? Wherever I come from, whatever discipline, when I talk and engage with somebody else from another discipline, from another sector, be it diplomats or diplomats with scientists, to respect and to trust and to listen. Right? And to try to identify the common language between us. Language is so important, and terms we use are so important, not just in framing our mindsets, but in how each one of us looks at the same term. I can look at a term and to me it means something as a scientist, and somebody else coming from politics looks at it and to him it means something totally different. And so again, agreeing on those terms, what they mean to both of us, and having an open mind to understand and listen. Now, how do you actually do that? This is nice preaching. Again, it starts young. It starts in universities in terms of university education and having pathways, programs where either you're trained scientist to find a career in diplomacy or the other way around, right? And maybe it's more easier for somebody to have a good scientific background and then to become a diplomat later on than the other way around, as David mentioned, that he finds it more difficult to go the other way. Now, also, I think one can direct to reward good collaboration. And how do you do that, right? How do you direct people where you want? By, for example, creating awards. So you create an award for an organization or a body that does exactly what you want. And so people will start competing for the award, doing what you want as a strategy. And then because you raise your bar and you explain why didn't you take this organization versus the other, and that's how you start shaping where you want the work to go. Now, I want to highlight another point that was brought up about this by, I think, Tim earlier on, about if we're going to sit at a table, work together, we need to acknowledge that there are power dynamics on that table and to make sure that everybody's on that table. So back to, it's not just a quota, but really the people on that table have an opinion and are listened to, and it's not dominated by one side. And we know to be that from the global north, global south, it's always dominated by one versus the other. And unless we acknowledge it and we put it at the table and we make sure every voice is heard. And again, I want to refer back to language. Most of these meetings are in one particular language, and the onus is on the other to understand that language rather than the other way around, right? So not really equally at that table to discuss. So if we really want to create partnerships that can move forward, we need to take these things into consideration as well as implicit bias. And I'm going to give an example here of how if we all collect and gather on a goal, we can achieve it, which is the stem cell law that we created in Jordan. So in Jordan, we saw the need to have a law, a policy to help guide us as scientists or as physicians on using stem cell technology. And so we came together and created a diverse group of politicians, lawyers, patients, physicians, scientists, and theologians, every stakeholder, to discuss and come together and listen to each other and educate each other. And then in the end, we were able to produce a law that became the first in the region and people take as an exemplar for the world. And lastly, I know we've been talking about how to go forward, but we also need to acknowledge the challenges that we face. And I want to mention two. First, the first barrier is that as I speak about listening to each other and sitting together, there is resistance to that. And especially not just within a country and again, we're talking levels, right? Level of a country, level of a region, and globally. There is resistance globally for a global north, global south, different cultures, different backgrounds to talk to each other. And for example, I'm going to talk about the stem cell laws there are guidelines set up by the ISSCR, who is the higher committee who puts the ethical guidelines. For example, does not have a Muslim in that committee, although there are 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. This is all about diplomacy in the end. And when a certain group is trying to submit a paper to discuss this issue, without mentioning names, there was a response from scientists saying that there's no need for Muslims to have a status on stem cell legality now until they improve their science in their home countries. To me, this needs to be addressed and brought out. So as we talk about the global north advancing and in a democratic way and listening to each other, sometimes they do not apply the same sets of regulations on the whole world. And so we need to be, sometimes we don't know what's happening in other parts of the world, and we need to be aware of that going forward.
Maybe just because I would like also to give the word to Izaskun Lacunza, that is taking care of the chat, and let the people asking and commenting here also to be able to ask you a few questions. But maybe could I ask you maybe to end a little bit this talk, some good examples that you can mention of science advice mechanisms that were working in your different levels that we are talking here, the European Union, regional, national, etc. Maybe Rana, if you want to think about a good example that you think should be promoted.
So I think the example I talked about, the stem cell law, is that as an approach that we did, usually it's a group of scientists sitting with the policymakers, but we went beyond. We said, let's create a committee of stakeholders from every stakeholder to sit together to discuss. So widening the net to get more people involved. And when you get more people involved, you guarantee that the diplomat who may be skeptical a little bit of the scientist has other people he has to make sure are satisfied and happy. So this approach is kind of unique and innovative. And then in the end, this committee is ongoing. So it's not that we just created the law and it's been approved by the parliament and it's in the government now. It's also about this law, this committee continues because science advances and new things come up. And so this dialogue is a continuous dialogue. And it at the same time serves to educate, right? Because at every new discovery, you're educating all these stakeholders on what's the mitochondrial 3 baby, CRISPR, and so on and so forth. And we see how this is very important because ultimately this trickles down to the societal level and people will start listening and most importantly will gain trust. Because when they see that everybody who counts is in that committee, it's not just the scientists, in case somebody has something with scientists, not just the diplomats, but everyone. And this trust allows people to not just accept it, but use it, right? Because we talk about laws, but then nobody applies the law. And so it's all about, again, building that trust, that feeling of belonging. And I'm gonna end with a good example in Jordan, because during COVID, when COVID happened, everybody felt this commitment to the country to really work hard. So there were the scientists trying to develop new kits to make the COVID-19 test faster, cheaper, people coming together in task force to help make sure the regulations, the masks, the hand washing was happening, the lockdowns, and now even with vaccine, we are the first country to vaccinate refugees. To make sure that they have a right as everybody else. And this is important. And I'm gonna here highlight another example of how science diplomacy is important, but it's nuanced to really understand it. And what was mentioned earlier was the Sesame Project. So the Sesame Project had, it was a combination of different countries in the Middle East together. Amongst them was Israel. And we all know that Israel is an apartheid state. And there are a lot of atrocities and injustices happening. I am a scientist in Jordan, right? I have a cousin who is a scientist in Palestine who cannot practice science, is not allowed to bring in material, has not the freedom to even have freedom of speech under occupation from Israel. So how can I work with an Israeli government while my cousin is telling me how she cannot do work? And then talk about science diplomacy. So I think what the basis of science diplomacy is justice. And I think this is our role, just like South Africa, apartheid. Everybody boycotted it until they did the right thing and had equal rights for everybody as part of our global and human duty to the world and to humanity. So for the Sesame, for example, if I want to talk or work with a scientist from Israel, I would say, if you admit and say that what's happening are atrocities from the Israeli government on the ground for the children, for the scientists, then we can work together. But until that happens, we cannot work together, and it will not be, it's our duty as scientists to the world, because ultimately scientists serve humanity.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you so much for your passion and your ideas. So maybe I will go now for David. Can you maybe identify these good examples of science advice mechanisms and how they can address better global challenges? And also maybe if I can, David, the relationship with society, which is so important from science advisors, not just to be devoted to the scientific community, but also to the, or the advisee, but also to the society.
Thanks, Anna. I could not agree more in your last point. And that is why, if you look at the report I posted originally in the chat on how to get science and reason into public policy, you'll see that one of the chapters says very clearly, you have to bring in society, not only because citizens can tell you things that experts and scientists and stakeholders simply cannot tell you about the problem, but also because if you want either the policy decision or the science underpinning it to be trusted, then citizens need to be part of the process of creating both the evidence base or assembling the evidence base and the policy decision. So that is why also in my team, we have a team working on participatory and deliberative democracy, and we have been working to set up the Conference on the Future of Europe and the various participatory platforms involving that, and have for a long time been involved in the STS field. So it is clear to me there is no route to more evidence-informed policies at national or international level that somehow avoids going through citizens, either for the science or for the policy. It's just not going to happen because ultimately the citizens, this is the big mistake I think the scientists make, is they think, look, hey, I've got the Nobel Prize, I've got the article in Nature, I've got the professorship, so you can trust what I say. But that itself is a fundamental misunderstanding of the science of trust. And the science of trust says it's based on three components. Yes, competence or excellence. But secondly, also the question of, is the source, in this case, the scientist, honest and open about their interests and their values? And thirdly, is there a community of interest between the citizen and these scientists? And I think the big trap for scientists is to avoid being seen as just another part of the cognitive elite who ordinary people see as the source of their problems rather than the solution to their problems. So, you know, who is passing these messages as a science? So absolutely, we have to go through citizens. And I maybe said too much on that point, so I'll stop there.
No, yeah, I agree completely. And maybe Suvi, you point the new position. Jan Marco Muller is already in the external service as a science advisor for Mr. Borrell and the external service. Would you consider this is a good example of what other ministers of foreign affairs should be doing maybe in the European Union?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I look at this from a very practical, hands-on viewpoint, for better or for worse. Exactly that example of now having our colleague Jan Marco in our team as a science advisor has been incredibly useful for the institution at large. And as I said, I'm amazed by how much one person can already achieve with their presence and with that sort of scientific mindset. And I'm not saying knowing science, all of it, but being able to point to relevant resources and networks that exist in this world. Because when you look into the world of science advisors and science diplomacy, there's so many layers there, and it's quite astonishing. And I speak from personal experience, when you come to it completely anew and you don't know any of it, you get lost and you get sort of confused quite quickly, trying to figure out who does what and where can you direct your request towards. So those secondments are, in my view, a very good way of doing that. And particularly in the EU institutions, I hope that we could, in going forward, be even more flexible in this regard, because I think we would be able to afford that mechanism. There are other things that could be thought of, obviously fellowships, for example. I know some of our member states already do that. There's the possibility of a sabbatical, which is something that I did when I went back to university to learn more about emerging technologies. That did not make me a data scientist or a scientist in any way, but it did make me a better informed diplomat. So there are different ways of doing this, but I think personally, I come back always to the idea of that personal interaction and getting to know an organizational culture in order to best influence the work that is ongoing. And that's very difficult to do from afar. But I think having those sort of a few entry points already in an organization will be an incredibly helpful bridge to bring those communities together. And also I have to give credit to you for the organization that you're involved in, and this conference and all the advocacy work that you've done for years. We hear it and we see it, and it does make an impact, and I can only encourage you to continue.
Thank you. That's nice. I would maybe like to finish by coming back to Thomas. Hopefully he can say maybe something. Thomas, can you hear us? Is your sound a little bit better? I'm not sure. So, okay, let's go for the questions. Ithaskun, if you are so nice to take them for us. And meanwhile, I would ask Fernando to show what the artist, Javier, the drawing artist, is doing for us. Meanwhile, Ithaskun is taking all these questions. If you can show us a little bit his conclusion about this. So nice.
Yes, very nice. Thank you, Anna. Hi, everybody. This is Izaskun, also S4D4C Partners, and I was taking a look at the questions. Since our colleagues at the Spotlight session couldn't take any questions, if this is okay with you, I'm going to bring in also the questions that were put into our colleagues. Some of them are not addressed to any particular speaker, so I invite everybody to just jump in if they feel that they have an answer. You know that we can vote for the questions as well, so I'm going to read first the most popular ones, so to say, and hopefully we will be able to read all of them. So the first one would be about how much do we know about the background of our communities? Are more diplomats trained in science and scientists trained in international relations? This is a very good question, and we are going to devote quite a lot of time to the training of people in the science diplomacy sphere, but still, maybe some of our colleagues want to reply and to share some insights about the question. So the question is, are more diplomats trained in science than scientists trained in international relations? Who wants to contribute?
David, come on. Nobody?
If no one wants to contribute, maybe I can share some of our findings in the project. So what we are, I mean, of course, the first thing that maybe needs to be considered is that the research community is much bigger than the diplomatic community. So I don't know, in Spain, we have something like 120,000 researchers, for instance, and it's uncomparable to the diplomatic corps. So this is something that needs to be considered. But it is also true that we see a high demand on training on science diplomacy from the research community. Although we are also training very many diplomats in our training courses and so on. But it could be the case that the research community is actually demanding a bigger say in the international relations and in general terms in having a bigger influence, I would say, in the policy making. But as I say, we will have a lot of time to discuss about training and so on during the conference. So let me go to the next question, and I hope I don't have to reply it myself. Let's go. So some of the things that, one of the things that we've been discussing a lot in this session is the competition versus collaboration issue and how they sometimes collide and they need to be integrated in any science diplomacy strategy that aims to be successful. And there is a question regarding the vaccine of COVID and what is the opinion of the speakers when it comes to this race for the vaccine has been a proof of competition winning collaboration? What would be your thoughts about this?
Maybe I'll comment briefly on that, as well as the previous question about this. How do we foster this collaboration? I think again, it's about finding a common goal, but doing that is not easy. But what I see as a silver lining of the COVID is the more opportunity for people to engage in dialogue through the online virtual community. Before, that was very difficult, and people would have to travel, and this would keep the discussion only on one side. But now with this openness, just like this panel coming from all over the world, we have the opportunity to listen and engage, to share, to really create consortiums that are otherwise impossible. So I think that's the silver lining coming out of methods of collaboration going forward and claiming that as fulfilling a purpose for humanity. And I want to also add to the previous question about you have to start young, you have to start at the university. For example, one thing we are doing in Jordan is when we teach our scientific courses, we include a component about what is the role of the scientists in the wider community. And we do it through a real practical project. So they have to go out and identify erroneous news that could be misleading for people, for government, and then they write a letter to the reporter to the journalist, to the diplomat who wrote this or quoted, and tell them why this is wrong. And this makes a scientist student feel this responsibility that my role is not just, to do an experiment in a lab, but to actually have a voice in the wider society.
Thank you, Rana. I think we still have some time for a few more questions. There is another one that I think that it has been quite addressed by many of the panelists, but still I am going to read it because it's been quite popular, let's say. So Juan Carlos from Peru says that if science is to be a new extension of diplomacy, it must participate in recognizing the remarkable developmental asymmetry between science in the North and in the South. Additionally, our research needs in the South are different than in the North. What do you think? Anyone wants to share some thoughts about this question? As I say, I think we've been covering the issue quite a lot, but still maybe there is something missing or that needs to be highlighted.
I'll take it because I represent the South, just like the person who asked the question. I think this is important to be acknowledged, but most importantly, to identify really what are the root causes. Many times people say, oh, it's about funding. Yes, funding is important, but really that's not the priority. The reason we are not advancing in science as the global North is because of bureaucracy, structural differences and challenges in the structure of the organization, creating the ecosystem. And I think if we can really focus on what are the problems and study them deeply, and not just study, not looking at science in general, but studying the reasons behind not advancing, we can then train our people, change the structures, and to be able to do better science going forward.
Thank you. I think we need to wrap up a little bit before we go. And I would love to ask my panelists one last thing before we leave is what would be your one recommendation to foster science diplomacy and scientific evidence in policymaking for addressing global challenges, if you have to choose one? Subi, can you maybe start?
Yes, well, mine is more directed towards my own colleagues, so sort of diplomats. And I think, as I mentioned, we are living through a sort of a fairly transformational time, and that means that our old skills are sometimes a bit old and outdated, and we need to acquire new ones, and we need to acquire new knowledge, and a lot of it is science and technology related. And look, if you've been doing this job for 20, 30, 40 years, maybe you feel like that ship has sailed and I'm not up to, the task of learning new things. But I think it is a responsibility for all of us to dedicate some of our time and effort into learning more about the new drivers of change and geopolitics, so that we are better informed about science and therefore better diplomats in our daily work.
Thank you, Subi. David, what would be your one recommendation?
Don't fall into the deficit model trap. Don't think the answer to better science diplomacy is just add more science. So don't try and solve political problems or genuine values disagreements by turning up the volume, turning up the noise around science. That's the most common mistake I make, is that scientists think you can solve real policy problems, differences of opinions, legitimate values differences in society on the basis of adding more science. And then it becomes actually actively unhelpful, because then all that happens is the political debate blows back into the science and disrupts your ability to reach consensus. So I think understand a bit of psychology and understanding how we think in terms of values and identities, and take a look at yourself as well, because scientists may think they work for independent organizations, but what we know is our own values frame what issues we decide to research and how we think about them. So kind of check your own values at the beginning of the process. And this is what we know from psychology through my side bias. We know that on issues where you have strong convictions around your values or your identity is engaged, anyone, doesn't matter how intelligent you are, doesn't matter what your thinking style, when you are confronted by evidence that challenges your identity or challenges your deep convictions, you will get busy taking down the evidence. You won't be changing your mind. And that applies to the Nobel Prize winning scientists as well. So embrace the fact that bringing science into diplomacy means you're going to have to get into the political issues rather than hiding behind a false curtain of independence.
Thank you, David. And I don't know if we are able to reach Thomas. I don't know, but maybe Rana, you can just finish. You have 30 seconds.
Yes. This is a recommendation to scientists. They need to write and communicate with society, to write to the level that everybody can understand what they're doing, so that can be used. So write, communicate, and listen.
Thank you. So, well, I think we have to finish here. Just remind you that this is just the start, okay? It's our first day. We have a whole week of activities, sessions, more interesting conversations. Tomorrow we start in the morning with 3 satellite sessions in the morning. Then we will be discussing about governments in science diplomacy, and please join us. And thank you for being there. And thank you, special thank you for my panelists. It was really a pleasure to have you here, and see you all along this week, hopefully. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye to everybody.